When I was about 6 years old, I told my parents that I wanted to play Little League. They were a bit surprised because for the past 2 years I had played soccer because I wanted to be like my older brother and he played soccer. My father, an avid baseball fan, was only too happy to sign me up. I'm sure he had hopes that I would be placed on his childhood team, the Reds. He grew up in the 70s being a fan of the Big Red Machine. But alas, it wasn't to be. And instead of being placed on the Reds or my mother's favorite team, the Cubs, the league decided that I was going to play for the Yankees. And I can hear the retrospective groans from my father because, in popular Star Wars terms, I was going to play for the evil Empire. And so when my father and I went to the first team meeting, they gave us an opportunity to pick our numbers. I wanted to be the number 3, but of course that popular number was already taken by another child. Instead, I was given the number 4. Disappointed, I asked my father who, if anyone, played baseball wearing the number 4. And he turned to me, matter-of-factly, and said, "Well, Lou Gehrig wore the number 4, and coincidentally, he played for the Yankees." After he explained to me what coincidentally meant, I asked him who was that, and so he went about telling me. So who was Lou Gehrig? And, well, arguably, he was the best first baseman that ever played the national pastime. And forgive me for a little bit. I'm a little bit of a baseball nerd, so I'm about to rattle off some statistics that are supposed to impress you, but they might not. He amassed 2,721 hits, 493 home runs, 1,995 RBIs, and he had a career batting average of 340. He was an all-star 7 times. He won the World Series 6 times, and he won the MVP twice. And more famous than all of those statistics was his 2,130 consecutive game streak that was thought until 1995 to be the single greatest record of all time. But I think that Lou Gehrig is most famous for the disease that carries his name. What we now know as ALS is a disease that affects the nervous system, which manifests itself through a severe decrease in strength, muscle coordination, and ultimately difficulty in speaking, swallowing, and even breathing. It's fatal. The problem for Lou Gehrig was not that this disease came about after he retired and was enjoying life, but that it happened in the middle of the 1938 season when he was 36 years old. But he turned in a good year that year. He hit 294 and had over 100 RBIs. Sorry, baseball nerd. In the 1939 season, you could tell. He only hit 143, and he had only 1 RBI through the first month of the season. And it was that year, on April 30th, that he decided he wasn't going to play anymore, and on May 2nd broke his streak, and he would never play another game. He went to the Mayo Clinic and was diagnosed with ALS, and the doctor gave him a life expectancy of 3 years. And when he was returning from Minnesota, he was greeted by some Boy Scouts waving to him, and he waved back, but he coyly told his companion that they're wishing me luck, and I'm dying. When he returned to New York City, the Yankees announced his retirement, and July 4th, remember that number, would be Lou Gehrig Appreciation Day. There was a doubleheader that day, and between games, Gehrig had a chance to speak to the crowd at hand. It was a day that he gave his famous farewell speech, and Ginny's going to play it for us over the loudspeaker, if technology allows it.
Today, I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth.
Thanks, Jimmy. While that is abridged, all I can say is really wow. When I heard these words for the first time, I didn't really understand what they meant. I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth. Here was a man who had what many kids dream of. He got to play a game for a job. But it was taken away in less than a year because of an illness. He no longer had the strength to do the thing he loved, and what came to mind was, I'm the luckiest man on the face of the earth. Not, I've been pretty lucky, or, I tried real hard, or even, this isn't fair. Gehrig felt compelled to tell the world that even though he no longer got to do what he loved, that he still felt blessed. Even though that he knew he was dying, knew that there was a definitive date that he wasn't supposed to live past, he still felt blessed. I believe that the Apostle Paul would have been happy with how Gehrig chose to face his adversity. In his letter to the Philippians, Paul tells them to rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Of course, we could take this as a minister like Alan or myself telling you to be happy, but I don't think that was what he meant. First of all, Paul wasn't the resident minister in Philippi. He started the church, sure, but he moved on because he was the evangelist. He had more churches to start, and he left it in the hands of the faithful, so he wasn't there, like Alan and I are here today. And second, and more important than the first, Paul was in jail. By this time, he had been arrested by the Romans and was awaiting transport to Rome. The fate of most persons arrested by the Romans was execution. So Paul also knew he was going to die. The amazing thing was that he kept on going. He kept writing to churches like Philippi to make sure that they did not splinter, that they weren't falling back into their old pagan ways, or that they weren't listening to false prophets. Paul kept on doing his job even though he knew he was going to die. On top of it, there were people that were spreading rumors about him and that were trying to make him upset. And he responded, "What does it matter?" Paul unknowingly followed Jesus' command to turn the other cheek. I know that if somebody was spreading rumors about me, my first response isn't, "Who cares?" But why are they talking about me like that? What did I do to them? But not Paul. He tells the Philippians that he doesn't care what people have to say about him as long as the good news about finding new life in Christ Jesus is preached. In fact, he says, and I quote, "What does it matter? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true, and in that I rejoice. Yes, I will continue to say, I rejoice." Out of this, we know that Paul's command to the Philippians to be joyful is not abject. After Paul gets done telling the Philippians how they should be Christ-like, he closes by telling them that they should be like him, that they should rejoice, and that even if they're in jail, and if they're facing death, they should rejoice. I consider myself the luckiest man on the face of the earth sounds a lot like rejoicing to me. The problem comes when we don't feel like rejoicing anymore. When life has become a burden, bills pile up, relationships wane, and maybe even tragedy strikes. How can we say thank you? How can we be joyful when tragedy strikes? In his essay, A Theodicy of Protest, John Roth develops a theodicy, or an explanation of evil, that centers itself on questioning the actions or inactions of God. He was reacting specifically to the democides and the genocides that took place in the 20th century, focusing more on the Holocaust. Roth wants to place blame for such things solely in the hands of God, though he doesn't want to refute that humans do have free will and that it is also their fault too. Roth argues that God is able to enter the world and make changes for good or bad. And he uses the resurrection of Jesus as an example. And I quote, Christians claim that God raised Jesus from the dead. If God did so, then God plausibly had the might to thwart the Holocaust long before it ended. What Roth wants to argue is that we as humans need to question, or more aptly put, protest to God. Humans need to appeal to God as to why such atrocities as the Holocaust, the killing fields of Cambodia, the genocide of Rwanda, or even the massacre at Newtown were allowed to happen. Roth says, in short, that God isn't doing all that God could to stop evils such as these, and we are responsible for protesting and for saying why. And we have biblical evidence of asking this question, why. The book of Job is a wonderful story about a man, Job, who suffered loss and endured pain through no fault of his own. Job was a man who praised God and was absolutely devout. He was also a well-off man, having many sheep, oxen, goats, and some servants, things that were important for a wealthy man at that time. Then, as a test of faith, God allowed bad fortune upon Job, killing Job's livestock and Job's family. But Job didn't turn away from his faith. He was then giving disfiguring boils all over his skin. And again, Job didn't turn away from God. Though he does wonder out loud to his friends why this is happening to him. He says, "This would be my consolation. I would even exult in unrelenting pain, for I have not denied the words of the Holy One." In this passage, Job would welcome death to subside his pain because he did not relent his faith in God. But he still doesn't know what he did wrong. He continues, "As your days like the days of mortals, or your years like human years, that you seek out my iniquity and search for my sin, although you know that I am not guilty, and there is no one to deliver out of your hand." Job says that he was innocent. His friends come back and tell him that Job must have done something wrong to deserve this punishment. But Job doesn't think so, because he knows that he's done nothing wrong. And so finally, Job breaks down and questions God, a God whom Job sees as the bringer of his pain, and asks, why? God responds to Job by appealing to God's power. He asks questions like, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Do you know the ordinances of the heavens? Can you establish their rule on earth? And who provides for the ravens its prey, when its young ones cry to God and wander about for lack of food?" To all of these questions, Job has to answer that God does those things. God was there at the beginning. God established the rule. God provides the food, not him. The ending of the story is a little bit happier. Job is rewarded, given back his livestock 2 times full. But Job's question was never answered, and he's left there, and I want to thank my preaching professor for this image, left there in a rocking chair on his porch, wondering why his children had to die. It's here, at this moment, where I would turn back to Lou's statement. Both of these men, Job and Gehrig, have felt pain for unanswerable reasons. One as a test of faith, the other because of an illness. And I'm sure that Gehrig, at some point between his diagnosis in mid-June and his speech on July 4th, thought of the question, why? But he eventually got to the point where he was able to look around, see the things he had, remember the things that he did, and the lives that he had touched and touched his along the wayward path we call life, and come out saying, "I'm blessed." He actually says this in the speech which you have. He tells the crowd about the wonderful people he got to play with, his coaches, about how his parents worked so hard that he could come out of poverty and do the things he wanted. He even told them about his wife. When you have a wife who has been a tower of strength and shown more courage than you dreamed existed, That's the finest I know. When he took time to look at his life, he saw that his life had been serendipitous, and he was left with a feeling like he was the luckiest man on the face of the earth. In other words, he follows Paul's command and rejoiced. And I think that we all need to feel sometimes that we are the luckiest people on the face of the earth and rejoice and know that God's there even when we question and ask why. Amen.